The next speaker is Chris Gilpin from WHO. Everybody knows Chris, doesn't need introduction, but he will update us on something that we all know. And they are the key changes to treatment of multidrug and rifampicin-resistant, and I think this issue is very relevant for this group because now we do have new drugs regimen and we have no tests.
Thank you, Daniela, for that introduction, and Katerina, thanks for the invitation to present. So it's good news that you all know what I'm about to present and that you've all read this rapid communication document on the key changes to the treatment of multidrug resistant and rifampicin-resistant TB. But what I will do is just give an overview of the key salient points associated with these key changes. The full policy guidelines are in development at the moment, but still have to go through formal WHO processes before the final guidelines are released. But what we did issue is this rapid communication just to let people know, let countries make the preparations for what the new guidance is going to be. But then in the second half of the presentation, I'd just like to focus on what we've done in terms of developing some guidance on diagnostics to actually meet the scale up for the new medicines. So here we see the WHO guidance on drug-resistant TB has evolved over time, and in the last 2 years we've seen a large number of documents, particularly related to isoniazid-resistant TB, to the new drugs bedaquiline and delamanid, and then finally with this rapid communication document. So we have managed to consolidate all of our diagnostics, treatment and supportive systems into what we call our compendium of WHO guidelines and associated standards, but all of these documents related to guidance on treatment and management will also be compiled into a single resource that we hope to have available at the end of the year. So Claudia showed this new grouping of medicines, so I won't pause on that, but the main focus is on the use of the fluoroquinolones, bedaquiline and linezolid as key medicines in new longer regimens, as well as the addition of Group B agents, clofazimine and cycloserine, and then a list of other add-on agents. But some of the key changes in the guidance that will come out is, and some of the uncertainties that still have to be worked through, is the optimal duration of bedaquiline, delamanid, and linezolid. So currently, bedaquiline and delamanid is only recommended for use up to 6 months and is considered off-label if these drugs are used longer than 6 months. Pyrazinamide is only counted or can only be counted as an effective medicine when DST confirms susceptibility, and we know we have problems performing phenotypic tests and even molecular tests for pyrazinamide resistance. Amikacin and streptomycin can only be considered if drug susceptibility confirms that they are indeed susceptible, and that supportive testing for audiometry is in place to make sure that if patients are actually having hearing damage, that it can be picked up early. And then we have other agents that have been used in the treatment of MDR for some time, the thioamides, PAS. These are now only to be considered as last resort medicines. Kanamycin and capreomycin, considered the second part of the second-line injectable agents, along with amikacin, are linked to poorer outcomes and are no longer recommended to be used in the treatment of drug-resistant TB. Similarly, with the moxifloxacin, clavulanic acid, without carbapenems, has poor outcomes. And drugs like thiacetazone, high-dose isoniazid, and garifloxacin, there was not enough information on these drugs to make it important to include them in the table. So now in constructing the longer MDR regimen, the choice of medicines depends on the balance of expected balance between harms and effectiveness. There is this move to an overall oral regimen over the use of injectables. The results of drug susceptibility testing will become increasingly important in informing the selection of a regimen, as well as an understanding of the population drug resistance surveillance of resistance. So, this is going to require significant changes at country levels in terms of how do they manage the procurement of new drugs, what do they do with their old medicines, and how are they going to manage their patients to get onto better regimens as quickly as possible. Just a little bit on the shorter regimen. There is some data that will also be incorporated into the guideline, just sort of saying that the STREAM Stage 1 trial showed that patients eligible for the shorter regimen, the likelihood of treatment success was very one to the longer MDR regimen. So that's the older, longer MDR regimen. So, one of the proposals now is to move forward to actually evaluate the shorter regimens, replacing the injectable agent with bedaquiline, but to do this under operational research conditions. So the programs that are already implementing the shorter regimen, one of the key aspects is to switch from the use of kanamycin to amikacin, and to apply a very low threshold to switch patients or non-responders to one of the longer regimens. And here's this mention of replacing the injectable with bedaquiline, but it must be done under operational research conditions. So this is more my area of work now, as the guidance on the diagnostics to support the revision to the treatment. And so later today, I hope that many of you will receive a WHO news flash that announces these 3 documents, 2 of which have been jointly developed with FIND. So the first is the critical concentrations for performing drug susceptibility testing. Second one, the blue one, is a technical manual for the detailed procedures for performing the phenotypic DST, as well as the procurement of the various drug powders and how you would go about making up your drug solutions to inoculate the media. And the third document is the use of next-generation sequencing technologies. So I'll briefly just touch on each of these documents. So the purple one on critical concentrations, it was the outcome of a systematic review that was WHO commissioned FIND to perform to look at the MIC distributions of phenotypically wild-type strains relative to strains that actually had mutations, or genotypically non-wild type strains. The medicines that were included were the second-line injectables, kanamycin, amikacin, and capreomycin, as well as an assessment and establishing for the first time critical concentrations for the newer medicines and repurposed medicines, bedaquiline, delamanid, clofazimine, and linezolid. So here we see this definition that we use for critical concentrations, the lowest concentration of an anti-TB agent that will inhibit the growth of at least 99% of wild-type strains of M. tuberculosis. And so to a simplified representation of how we establish a critical concentration is to look at the distribution of MICs for the wild-type strains, which is the darker distribution there, and then look at the distribution of strains that actually have mutations associated with resistance. And in an ideal situation, we establish a critical concentration in between those distributions that allows us to clearly separate susceptible from resistant strains. But it's not always as simple and as clear-cut as that. And here's another example and a rationale for establishing a new definition, a clinical breakpoint definition, which defines MICs which separate strains which are likely to respond to treatment from those that are not likely to respond to treatment. And so we have, for the first time, been able to establish a clinical breakpoint concentration for moxifloxacin. So again, we see a normal distribution of wild type here, and then 3 overlapping red distributions where we see different increases in the MICs, which correspond to different mutations. And so with some mutations increasing the dose of the medicine, for example, moxifloxacin, you can overcome the elevated MICs associated with those mutations. But in some instances, when you have MICs above the clinical breakpoint concentration, even increasing the dose is not likely to be effective. So this is a new table of critical concentrations that is being published today in the DST manual with the new grouping of the medicines. There are a number of concentrations highlighted in red. These are what we're calling interim concentrations, interim critical concentrations, because they, often they are made either based on relatively limited data. But this is what we are recommending to laboratories to use these concentrations for testing. And so this DST manual actually provides the DST methods for both first and second line drugs. The methods included are Lowenstein-Jensen media, Middlebrook media, as well as the commercial midget system. And they incorporate a clinical interpretation table which actually gives guidance on what should be the initial diagnostic test to detect resistance to this particular medicine, what are the DST methods available, and then making a proposal for a reference standard for detection of resistance to that particular agent. Also, the document includes the detailed procedures as well as where you can procure the various pure powders or lyophilized drugs to perform the drug susceptibility testing. The other document is the use of next-generation sequencing technologies, and this document focuses on both the targeted next-generation sequencing approach as well as whole genome sequencing. But for both of these approaches for sequencing, essentially the workflow is the same. You start with your organism, you extract the DNA from that organism, you then cut it into pieces and then amplify those individual pieces to create your library that you then feed into a sequencer, which generates a series of short DNA sequence information that can all be aligned and put together to give you the whole genome sequence data. So this guide actually provides a description of the various common next-generation sequencing platforms that are available, such as Illumina, Ion Torrent, and Oxford Nanopore. It presents the findings of the systematic review correlating the association with genotypic and phenotypic DST, and also provides a list of mutations and the confidence in their association with drug resistance. And then the final chapter includes some implementation considerations for using sequencing. So this is just to show that this standardized methodology now is being applied to actually indicate the confidence in the association of observed mutations based on the prevalence of detection of these mutations and the increase in MIC that they're associated with. So in terms of these new guidance on treatment of drug-resistant TB, the implications, or the main implications for diagnostics are the following: that all patients with rifampicin resistance or multidrug resistance TB should undergo second-line probe assay testing or some other form of molecular genotypic rapid DST to exclude resistance to the fluoroquinolones and amikacin. DST should be performed for all medicines for which there is a reliable DST method available, either at the start of treatment or on isolates collected from patients during treatment monitoring. What shouldn't happen is that we wait for DST before initiating patients on therapy. Capacity to perform DST to at least bedaquiline and linezolid should be established as a priority. And what we do want is to have patients that are on these new regimens to have isolates collected from them during treatment monitoring. So in the event of failing treatment, that we have strains that can go back to apply next-generation sequencing to help elucidate any new or novel mechanisms associated with resistance to these newer drugs. So I'll stop there and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. Question for Chris? Yes.
Great talk. So this is Soumya Chakraborty from Cepheid. Thanks. So one quick question regarding, unfortunately for this new generation drugs, you cannot do a test and treat because there are no quick molecular tests available. So if we have to depend on DST as well as patient treatment outcomes, which are both time consuming, and there are reports of pre-existing resistance in certain strains, and as you pointed out, there are RAVs which have higher critical concentrations against bedaquiline. Using this strategy, don't you think that we'll be actually selecting for resistance to these drugs while we wait for the patient response, and it'll proliferate resistance in future? And do you think that we could press in service some rapid tests like NGS, or at least some gatekeeper technologies which do at least target what we know and use it as a rule-out test, not to treat the patients who might have higher critical concentrations or probable resistance?
So, yeah, you raise a whole series of interesting
Yes.
points and challenges for which, of course, we don't have all the answers. But I guess the simple response to your question is that rolling out, in a majority of settings, these are new medicines, new regimens that will be applied. So there will be very low levels of resistance to these drugs in the patients being diagnosed and put on treatment. So what we have to do is we have to balance our knowledge of detecting resistance with methods we have available now, while understanding that we need to build new knowledge so that Cepheid can have their rapid bedaquiline resistance test to detect, some resistant variant in the future. But, this is early stages. I think we've put the basics down. Our understanding of that correlation between phenotype and genotype is established. And so we can move forward from there. But hopefully we've got a good base of knowledge and understanding about resistance in these drugs that will allow us to build our knowledge base moving forward.
Thank you.
Norbert?
Thank you very much. Norbert Heinrich from University of Munich. My question actually ties into very much what the previous question was asking about, and I hope it's not off topic, but with the recommendation of the new drugs in category A, I think we're all encouraged to see this progress, but share some worries, and I would like to ask whether there is something from the review process that might have been learned, for example, from South Africa, where the drug was used a lot, whether certain, in unsuccessful treatment there were certain mutations or patterns coming up that were of interest.
So obviously a lot of the data from South Africa was used to inform our critical concentration cutoff. Now, even from those studies in South Africa, they did identify various resistant variants that were not necessarily always associated with increases in MICs. Only strains that had very high increases in MIC were laboratory-generated artificial strains. So I think the work that was done in South Africa really informed our cut point to at least establish it as an interim concentration. But again, we need to be evaluating these strains isolated from patients on these medicines in a larger numbers to actually show, do some of these resistance variants that we detect, are they consistently associated with increased MICs that will actually mean that patients will fail treatment?
No. Okay.
I hope that helps.
Last one.
Why clofazimine and bedaquiline moved to group 1 and delamanid is still in group 3? Can you comment?
Long story.
Yeah. I'm not sure.
Based on evidence.
Yeah, so this was a robust evaluation from individual patient data that was compiled through McGill University from something like 16,000 patients.
That was based on evidences. But thank you, Chris. Okay. And I think we had an excellent first session. And Norbert, I can guarantee that the majority of the isolates from trials on bedaquiline have been sequenced with different isolates from the same patients, and there are some evidences of some resistance building in some isolates. But it will take time.